When I discovered that my daughter had taken every cent from our bank accounts and left with her criminal boyfriend, I was filled with rage. I couldn't believe she would betray us this way. Then my 16-year-old grandson walked in, smiling with unexpected calmness. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Grandpa, don't worry. I've already taken care of everything." Hours later, the phone rang. It was my daughter. Her voice cracked as she screamed down the line, more desperate than I had ever heard her before. If you want to see how this plays out, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. The metal safe door hung open like a mouth frozen in a scream, and I knew before looking inside that everything was gone. $250,000. Every penny we'd saved for Cordelia's cancer treatment had vanished overnight. My hands trembled as I picked up the note my daughter had left behind, her handwriting shaky and desperate. The words blurred through my tears, but their meaning cut deep into my chest. She'd taken it all for him, for Dex, claiming his mother needed emergency surgery that couldn't wait another day. I stood there in our bedroom, staring at that empty safe for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The morning light streamed through the curtains, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air, mocking the heaviness in my chest. Cordelia was still sleeping in the next room, exhausted from yesterday's chemotherapy session. Stage 3 lung cancer didn't care about our financial planning or our daughter's romantic delusions. The doctors had given us 18 months if we could afford the experimental treatment at MD Anderson. Without it, maybe 6 months at best. The clinical trial slot we'd fought so hard to secure would be gone by Monday if we couldn't make the deposit. My grandson Jackson appeared in the doorway, his 16-year-old frame lanky and awkward in basketball shorts and an old Astros jersey. He looked at the safe, then at me, and his expression didn't change. That should have been my first warning sign. Any normal teenager would have shown shock, anger, something. But Jackson just leaned against the doorframe and said those words I'll never forget. "Grandpa, don't worry. I've already taken care of everything." His voice was calm, almost eerily so, like he was telling me he'd already made breakfast or taken out the trash. The bank statement spread across my desk told the same story in black and white. 3 withdrawals over 3 days, each one for $80,000 and change, just under the federal reporting limit. Marlo had been smart about it, or maybe Dex had coached her. Thursday morning, Friday afternoon, Saturday, just before closing. The timing was deliberate, calculated to avoid triggering any alerts until it was too late. Our local branch manager, who'd known Marlo since she was in pigtails, had processed the transactions himself. She must have spun him quite a story. I thought about calling the police immediately, but what would I say? My 42-year-old daughter, whose name was on the accounts as my medical proxy, had legally withdrawn money that technically belonged to both of us. The detective would probably laugh me out of the station. Besides, Marlo wasn't some stranger who'd robbed us. She was my daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike in Bel Air Park, the young woman who'd become a registered nurse to help people heal. How had she fallen so far, so fast? The sound of Cordelia coughing from the bedroom pulled me back to reality. That wet, rattling sound that had become our morning alarm clock these past few months. I helped her to the bathroom, noticing how much weight she'd lost just this week. Her wedding ring spun loose on her finger, and her cheekbones looked sharp enough to cut glass. The chemotherapy was buying us time. But at what cost? And now, without money for the experimental treatment, even that borrowed time would run out soon. She didn't know yet about the money, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her, not when she was already fighting so hard just to breathe. Jackson was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, making coffee like any other Sunday morning. He'd been living with us for the past year, ever since Marlo's latest boyfriend before Dex had turned violent, and she'd asked us to keep Jackson safe. The kid had seen too much for 16, watched his mother cycle through relationships like seasons, each one worse than the last. But he'd never lost that strange composure, that ability to observe everything while revealing nothing. He pushed a mug toward me, black with 2 sugars, exactly how I liked it. "Mom called while you were upstairs," he said, stirring his own coffee with unnecessary focus. "She's at that motel off Highway 6. The Bluebonnet Inn. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her." He paused, then added something that made my blood run cold. "She said the police are looking for Dex. Something about an old warrant from Texas. Grand theft auto," she said. "From 3 years ago." His tone suggested he'd known about this before today, but I was too overwhelmed to process that thought fully. The old grandfather clock in the hallway, an inheritance from my father, ticked steadily through the silence. That clock had marked every important moment in our family's life, from birthday parties to funeral gatherings. Now it seemed to be counting down to something else entirely, though I couldn't say what. Time was running out for Cordelia. That much was certain. But maybe time was running out for all of us, for the family we'd once been before Dex crawled into our lives like a cancer of his own. My phone rang, and Marlowe's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but Jackson nodded at me encouragingly. Her voice came through broken and hysterical, barely coherent between sobs. "Dad, something terrible happened. Dex is gone. He took everything I brought, and left me here with nothing. The police came looking for him an hour ago. They said he's wanted for grand theft, that he stole cars and sold them to chop shops. Dad, I didn't know, I swear I didn't know. But that's not even the worst part." She paused, and I could hear her trying to catch her breath, trying to form words around whatever horror she'd discovered. The morning had already brought enough disasters to last a lifetime, but apparently we weren't done yet. Outside, a cardinal landed on the bird feeder Cordelia had insisted on hanging last spring, back when she still had the energy to watch the birds. It pecked at the seeds, scattering them to the ground where the squirrels would get them later. Waste and loss everywhere I looked. "Dad," Marlowe continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "I found something in his jacket pocket. A newspaper clipping from Houston, from 3 years ago, about a robbery at a jewelry store where the owner died. 71 years old. Had a heart attack during the robbery. The article says the suspect was never caught, but there's a security photo, and Dad, it's him. It's definitely Dex. He killed someone, Dad. The man I loved is a killer." The words hung in the air like a death sentence of their own. I looked at Jackson, expecting shock or fear, but he just sipped his coffee and watched me with those steady eyes. "Grandpa?" he said quietly, setting down his mug with deliberate care. "What if someone died because of Dex? Would Mom still protect him?" The question wasn't hypothetical, I realized. He was preparing me for something, though I couldn't imagine what more there was to prepare for. Cordelia called out from upstairs, her voice weak but insistent. I told Marlowe I'd call her back and went to check on my wife. She was sitting up in bed, more alert than she'd been in days, holding the empty prescription bottle for her pain medication. "Harlan," she said, using that tone that meant she knew something was wrong. "Why is our safe open, and why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" There was no point in lying to her. After 43 years of marriage, she could read me like one of her mystery novels. I told her everything, watching her face cycle through the same emotions I'd experienced just an hour ago. Shock, disbelief, anger, and finally a terrible resignation. But then she surprised me, as she often did. "Let the boy handle it," she said, nodding toward the kitchen where Jackson was. "He's been planning something for weeks. I've seen him with that old UV light from his science project, the one about how the FBI tracks money. He's smarter than we give him credit for, Harlan, and he loves us more than Marlowe loves that criminal." The grandfather clock chimed noon, its deep bronze tone reverberating through the house like a warning bell. 12 strikes for 12 hours since Marlowe had cleaned out our accounts. 12 strikes for the 12 months Cordelia might not live to see so. I thought about the old saying that revenge is a dish best served cold, but I wondered if we had time to let anything cool. The temperature outside was climbing toward 95 degrees, typical for Houston in August. But inside our house, Everything felt frozen in that moment between disaster and whatever came next. Jackson walked into the bedroom, carrying something small in his hand. Not quite a smile on his face, but something close to satisfaction. "Grandma, Grandpa," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed like he used to when he was little and wanted to hear a bedtime story. "I need to tell you something about that money Mom took, and about what's going to happen to Dex." He opened his hand, revealing a $20 bill that seemed to glow faintly under the bedroom light. "You see," Jackson continued, his voice taking on a teacher's patience, "3 weeks ago, I did a school project about federal crime prevention, specifically about how law enforcement tracks marked bills in kidnapping cases. Did you know you can buy UV ink online for less than $20, and that most criminals never think to check their cash under blacklight?" He held up the bill, and under the UV flashlight he pulled from his pocket, it glowed bright blue. "I marked $2,000 of my savings and left it where I knew Mom and Dex would find it. They took it 2 days ago, right before the bank withdrawals." The Bluebonnet Inn squatted beside Highway 6, like a diseased animal waiting to die, its neon sign flickering between blue and darkness in the midday heat. Marlowe had called 3 more times in the past hour, each call more hysterical than the last, but I'd let them go to voicemail. Jackson insisted we needed to wait. The timing was everything in what he'd set in motion 3 weeks ago. The boy sat at our kitchen table now, calm as a chess player who could see 12 moves ahead, while I paced the linoleum floor that Cordelia had wanted to replace before her diagnosis changed all our plans. What Jackson had shown us made my head spin with equal parts admiration and unease. 3 weeks ago, he'd deliberately left $2,000 in cash on his dresser, money he'd saved from 16 months of working part-time at the local Kroger. But this wasn't ordinary cash. He'd marked every single bill with UV ink, invisible to the naked eye, but glowing like neon under black light. He'd learned the technique from his chemistry teacher for an extra credit project on forensic science. The official story was academic curiosity, but Jackson had been planning something far more practical. The trap was simple, almost elegant in its simplicity. Jackson had counted on his mother's desperation and Dex's greed. Knew they'd take any cash they found lying around the house. Sure enough, the marked bills had disappeared 2 days ago, right before Marlowe had started draining our bank accounts. But here was the part that showed real planning. Jackson had been keeping track of where Dex went, following his social media posts, watching him check in at various locations. Casinos, liquor stores, strip clubs, all places with security cameras that would capture him spending marked money. Cordelia shuffled into the kitchen, moving slowly but with more determination than I'd seen in weeks. The morning's revelations had given her something she'd been missing through all the chemotherapy and radiation treatments. Purpose, maybe, or just healthy anger instead of the quiet acceptance that had been eating her from the inside almost as fast as the cancer. She looked at Jackson with grandmother's eyes that saw past the teenage awkwardness to the man he was becoming, forced to grow up too fast by his mother's failures. She patted his shoulder as she passed, a gesture that said everything without words. "That man said something last week," Cordelia mentioned, her voice still raspy from the treatments, "when he was drunk and thought I was sleeping on the couch. He was on the phone with someone, laughing about some old man in Houston who'd begged for his heart medication during a robbery. Said the fool dropped dead right there in his jewelry shop, saved him the trouble of keeping him quiet." She stirred honey into her tea, the spoon clinking against ceramic in a rhythm that matched the grandfather clock's ticking. "I wanted to tell you, Harlan, but I thought I might have dreamed it. The medications make everything fuzzy sometimes." The revelation settled over the kitchen like a shroud. This wasn't just about stolen money or Marlowe's latest romantic catastrophe. We were harboring information about a killer, Or at least we had been until he'd run off with our life savings. The jewelry store owner mentioned in that Houston newspaper clipping wasn't just a statistic anymore. He was a 71-year-old man who'd died begging for his heart medication, probably thinking about his own wife, his own family, in those final moments. The parallel to our situation, with Cordelia needing her cancer medication, wasn't lost on any of us. Jackson pulled out his phone and played a recording that made my blood run cold. Dex's voice, slurred with alcohol, but clear enough for any jury to understand, bragging about the Houston job. The details he shared were specific, grotesque. Things only the killer would know. How the old man had clutched his chest, how his lips had turned blue, how the cash register had been mostly empty anyway, so the whole thing had barely been worth the effort. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of confession, recorded 2 nights ago, while Dex thought Jackson was playing video games in his room with headphones on. "The thing is, Grandpa," Jackson explained, his voice taking on that eerily mature quality, "Mom knows about Houston. She has to. I heard them arguing about it last month. She said something about blood money, and he told her she'd already spent plenty of it on her new clothes and jewelry. She didn't leave him then. She stayed and helped him plan how to get more money from you and Grandma." The boy's eyes hardened as he spoke about his mother, love and disappointment waging war across his young face. "She chose him over Grandma's cancer treatment. That's all I needed to know." The front door opened suddenly, making us all jump. But it was just our elderly neighbor from next door, bringing over a casserole like she did every Sunday since Cordelia's diagnosis. The normalcy of the gesture felt surreal after the morning's revelations. We thanked her, made small talk about the weather and her grandchildren, all while sitting on evidence of murder and theft. After she left, the house felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in with the weight of what we knew. The grandfather clock chimed 2 in the afternoon. Marlo arrived an hour later without calling first, bursting through the door like a hurricane that had finally made landfall. Her makeup was ruined, black mascara streaking down her cheeks in parallel lines that made her look like a tragedy mask. She smelled wrong, too, not like her usual perfume, but like cheap motel soap and desperation. The designer purse Dex had bought her with what I now knew was blood money hung from her shoulder, looking as out of place as she did in our modest home. She started talking before any of us could speak, words tumbling out in a frantic cascade. The story she told didn't match the one from her phone calls. Now Dex hadn't abandoned her, but had gone to handle some business, would be back for her soon. The money wasn't stolen but borrowed, an investment in their future together that would pay off triple within a month. The police were harassing him over a misunderstanding from years ago. Each lie was more elaborate than the last, a tower of deception built on a foundation of our family's savings. But then she saw Jackson's face, the way he looked at her with those steady eyes that had seen too much to believe in fairy tales anymore. Something in her expression cracked, and for a moment I saw my little girl again, the one who used to cry when she accidentally stepped on bugs. "Mom's getting worse, isn't she?" Marlo asked, the question seemingly coming from nowhere, but probably the only truth she'd spoken since walking in. She looked at Cordelia, really looked at her for the first time in months, seeing past her own drama to notice how thin her mother had become. Cordelia didn't answer with words. She just lifted her teacup with hands that shook from more than just weakness, and in that gesture was all the accusation Marlo needed. "You took the money that could have bought me more time with my family. You chose a killer over your mother's life." The silence stretched between them, mother and daughter, until it became unbearable. The grandfather clock ticked through it all, marking seconds that Cordelia couldn't afford to lose. "I can fix this," Marlo said finally, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Dex will come back with the money. He promised. His mother really does need surgery, but once she's better, he'll pay everything back with interest." She was grasping at straws now, trying to build a bridge back to being the daughter we'd raised instead of the stranger she'd become. But some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with good intentions and empty promises. Jackson stood up slowly, deliberately, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. He walked to his backpack and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with papers. "Mom," he said, and the word carried so much weight it seemed to make Marlowe shrink. "I need to show you something about the money you took, and about what Dex has been doing with it." He spread the papers on the kitchen table like a dealer showing his cards, and I saw Marlowe's face go white. The papers were screenshots from social media, Dex's own posts bragging about his spending, casino check-ins with photos of $100 bills on poker tables, receipts from high-end liquor stores time-stamped just hours after the bank withdrawals. Even a photo from a strip club called the Gold Rush where he'd been making it rain with what looked like our money. Each image was dated, showing he'd been spending their supposed future while she'd been crying alone in that motel. "No," Marlowe whispered, then louder. "No, you're making this up. You've always hated him. You're just jealous because he makes me happy." But her voice cracked on the word happy, and we all heard it. She wasn't happy, hadn't been for months, maybe years. She was addicted to the drama, to the intensity of toxic love that felt like passion, but was really just mutual destruction. Dex was just the latest and worst in a long line of men who'd recognized her vulnerability and exploited it. The marked bills were the final piece of evidence Jackson presented, holding up the UV light to show the glowing ink on the $20 bill he'd kept as proof. He explained how every dollar Dex had spent could be traced, how the police would be very interested in following this paper trail, especially once they connected it to the Houston murder. "The money's being spent right now, Mom," he said with finality. "Dex is out there using it at places with cameras. Every transaction is being recorded. We can stop him from doing this to another family." Marlowe looked around the kitchen wildly, like a trapped animal seeking escape. Her eyes landed on the grandfather clock, and something about its steady ticking seemed to break her. "You don't understand," she said, and now tears were flowing freely. "I know about Houston. I've known for weeks. But if I turn him in, if I help you, he'll tell everyone I knew. I could lose my nursing license, go to jail. Jackson would have nobody." The admission hung in the air like poison gas. "You already lost me, Mom," Jackson replied, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "You lost me the day you chose him over Grandma's life. But you can still do the right thing. You can still help us stop him." He pulled out his phone and showed her one final thing, a voice message from Dex sent just an hour ago. In it, Dex was laughing with someone, calling Marlowe his stupid cash cow, saying he'd dump her as soon as the money ran out, that he already had another woman lined up in Dallas. The sound Marlowe made after hearing that recording wasn't quite a scream, and wasn't quite a sob, but something trapped between the two. She collapsed into the kitchen chair she'd sat in thousands of times as a child, back when her future had seemed bright and full of promise. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, highlighting the silver threads in her dark hair, premature aging from 3 years of stress with Dex. Even her hands looked older, shaking as she reached for the phone Jackson still held, replaying Dex's casual cruelty about her being nothing but a walking ATM. 3 hours passed before Dex finally answered Marlowe's 15th call, and we all heard his voice through the speaker because she was too broken to hold the phone steady. He was drunk again, slurring his words but clear enough in his meaning. He wasn't coming back for her, had already moved on to what he called better opportunities in Dallas. The way he talked about women like they were lottery tickets to scratch off made my stomach turn. Marlowe begged him to come back, promised more money she didn't have, and that's when he laughed and told her about Houston, told her everything. The confession that poured out of Dex over the next 10 minutes was worse than anything we'd imagined. The jewelry store owner hadn't just died during the robbery. He'd died slowly, painfully, clutching a photo of his wife, who'd passed from cancer the year before. Dex described it like he was recounting a football game. casual and detached, even mentioning how he'd stepped over the dying man to grab the cash from the register. Only $43 had been in there. Barely enough for gas. A man's life for $43 and some costume jewelry that turned out to be fake. The worst part was how Dex complained about it, like the old man had inconvenienced him by dying. Jackson was recording everything on his backup phone, holding it steady despite the horror of what we were hearing. His face had gone pale, but his hands didn't shake. Growing up with Marlowe's parade of dangerous men had given him an education no school could provide. When Dex finally hung up, after calling Marlowe names that made even me flinch, Jackson already had the audio file saved in multiple places on his phone. Cordelia stood up from her chair, moving with more energy than she'd shown in months, and walked to the old wooden cabinet where we kept family photos. She pulled out an album from 1998, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. It was a newspaper clipping she'd saved, yellow with age, about a robbery in Austin where the store owner had survived but been paralyzed. The description of the suspect matched Dex down to the scar on his left hand, though he'd been using a different name then. "I knew I recognized him," she said quietly. 25 years younger, but the same dead eyes. I should have said something sooner. The revelation that Dex had been doing this for decades, leaving a trail of victims across Texas, changed everything. This wasn't just about our stolen money or even one death anymore. This was about a predator who'd been hunting vulnerable people for half his life. Marlowe had just been his latest mark, chosen for her access to our savings and her emotional weakness after her third divorce. The elaborate story about his sick mother had probably been used before, refined over years of practice. Marlowe hadn't moved from her chair, staring at the phone like it might ring again with Dex saying it was all a joke. But even she knew that fantasy was dead now. The designer clothes he'd bought her seemed to mock her from where she sat. Every gift had been an investment in his con, every romantic gesture calculated. The jewelry he'd given her for her birthday was probably bought with money from some other family's tragedy. "Mom," Jackson said, his voice carrying weight beyond his 16 years. "We need to go to the police. Today. Now. Before he hurts someone else." He already had everything organized on his phone, the marked bills evidence, the recordings, screenshots of Dex's spending spree. The boy had built a case that any detective would love, gift-wrapped and ready. All we needed was for Marlowe to confirm what she knew, to stop protecting the man who'd called her worthless. But Marlowe shook her head, fear replacing the heartbreak in her eyes. She started talking about accomplice laws, about losing her nursing license, about going to prison and leaving Jackson without any parents at all. His father had disappeared years ago. Another one of Marlowe's poor choices. She painted a picture of Jackson in foster care, of Cordelia dying alone while her daughter rotted in prison. The manipulation was subtle, but effective, using our love for each other as a weapon against doing the right thing. The grandfather clock chimed 5 in the afternoon, and with each strike, I felt time slipping away. Not just Cordelia's time, though that was the most precious, but our chance to stop Dex before he disappeared completely. He'd mentioned Dallas, but that could have been a lie. He could be heading for Mexico or Canada. Every minute we sat here debating was another minute he got farther away, another minute closer to finding his next victim. That's when we heard the knock at the door, 3 sharp raps that sounded official. We all froze, looking at each other with the same thought. Had someone already called the police? Jackson went to answer it while the rest of us held our breath. But it wasn't the police. It was a woman from 2 houses down, holding an envelope she said had been delivered to her by mistake. When Marlowe saw the handwriting on the front, she went even paler. It was from Dex, postmarked yesterday. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper and a USB drive. The letter was short, just 3 sentences that changed everything. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone. Check the drive for a surprise. Remember, you knew everything." The USB drive felt heavier than it should have as Jackson plugged it into his laptop, and what appeared on screen made Marlo scramble for the bathroom. It was video from Dex's phone, showing Marlo helping him plan the theft, discussing how to withdraw the money without triggering alerts, even practicing the lie she'd tell the bank manager. But there was more on the drive, files that showed the full scope of Dex's crimes, photos of jewelry taken from victims, detailed notes about past robberies, even a list of future targets that included 3 other families in our neighborhood. Our elderly neighbor's name was on there, circled with a note about her husband's life insurance payout. The young couple with the baby down the street had inherited money marked as accessible. Dex had been planning to work his way through our entire street, using Marlo as his entrance into the community's trust. The evidence was overwhelming, but it also implicated Marlo deeper than we'd known. She hadn't just been a victim of manipulation. She'd been an active participant in stealing our money. The video showed her laughing about how easy it would be, how her parents trusted her completely. Whether Dex had been recording her for insurance or just for his own amusement didn't matter. What mattered was that Marlo couldn't claim ignorance anymore. Cordelia was the first to speak after we'd absorbed the full horror of what was on that drive. Her voice was weak from illness, but strong with resolve. "We call the police. All of it. Every bit of evidence. Let them sort out who's guilty of what." She looked at Marlo with disappointment so deep it seemed to age her another year. "You chose this. You chose him over us, over me. Now you can choose to do right or keep protecting him. But either way, I'm calling them." She reached for the phone with hands that shook from more than just cancer. "Wait," Jackson said suddenly, his mind clearly working through something. "There's another way. A better way." He pulled up something on his phone. A website for the FBI's most wanted list. If we report this to local police, it might get buried. But if we go federal, if we report the interstate crimes, the marked bills crossing state lines. He trailed off. But we understood. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice on a scale that Dex couldn't escape from. Marlo was sobbing now, ugly crying that reminded me of when she was 5 and had broken her favorite toy. But she wasn't 5 anymore. She was 42 and had broken something much more precious. She'd broken trust, broken family bonds, broken her mother's heart in what might be Cordelia's last year of life. The money could possibly be recovered, but the time Cordelia had lost, the stress that had probably accelerated her decline, that was gone forever. "There's something else," Marlo finally managed to say through her tears. "Something I didn't want you to know. I'm pregnant. 8 weeks. It's Dex's." The words landed like a bomb in the quiet kitchen. Another child for Marlo to potentially fail. Another connection to a murderer that couldn't be severed. Jackson's face went completely blank, the careful control he'd maintained finally cracking. A sibling who would be the child of the man who'd stolen their grandmother's cancer treatment money. Cordelia closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, they were clear and determined. "Then we do this right. We do this legal. We make sure Dex goes away for so long that child never has to know him. And Marlo, you get help. Real help. Therapy, parenting classes, whatever it takes to break this cycle." She turned to me, and in her eyes I saw the woman I'd married. Fierce and protective even while dying. "Harlan, call your cousin in Austin, the one who works for the Texas Rangers. We're going to need all the help we can get." The house felt different as we prepared to take action. This wasn't just about our family anymore. This was about the Houston victim's family getting justice. This was about preventing future victims. This was about Jackson not having to watch his mother destroy herself and everyone around her. The USB drive sat on the table, like evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. Dex thought he'd been clever leaving it, thought it would keep Marlo quiet. He hadn't counted on a 16-year-old boy who'd learned that sometimes the right thing and the easy thing were opposites. As the sun began to set, painting our kitchen in shades of orange and red, Jackson made one more revelation. "I know where he is," he said quietly. Dex posted on Instagram an hour ago. He's at a motel off Interstate 45, just north of Huntsville, the Colonial Inn. He tagged the location, probably drunk and not thinking. He's only 40 miles away. The boy pulled up the post on his phone, showing Dex with a bottle of expensive whiskey, $100 bills visible on the nightstand behind him. Our money, being flaunted on social media while Cordelia lay dying. The Huntsville motel sat 40 miles north of Houston, close enough to reach in an hour, but far enough that Dex must have felt safe. My cousin, the Texas Ranger, had agreed to meet us at a truck stop 5 miles from the motel, bringing backup and federal connections. The plan was simple. We would provide the evidence. They would make the arrest. And justice would finally catch up with a man who'd been running from it for 25 years. Even Marlo, shaking with morning sickness and withdrawal from Dex's toxic influence, understood what needed to happen. The drive up Interstate 45 felt longer than it should have, each mile marker passing like a countdown to something inevitable. Cordelia had insisted on coming despite my protests, saying she'd rather die seeing justice done than waste away in bed wondering. She sat in the back seat with Jackson, her thin hand holding his stronger one, drawing strength from her grandson's determination. Marlo drove separately, following us in her car that Dex had picked out, paid for with blood money. The morning was already hot, heat waves rising from the asphalt like ghosts of all the people Dex had hurt over the years. My cousin was waiting at the truck stop as promised, his ranger badge catching the sunlight as he stepped out of his unmarked car. He'd brought 2 FBI agents with him, serious-looking men in dark suits. They examined Jackson's evidence with professional interest, especially the marked bills and the recordings of Dex's confessions. One agent mentioned they'd been tracking similar robberies across 3 states, all with the same pattern but different names. Dex had apparently been using at least 6 identities, each one carefully crafted to appeal to a different type of vulnerable woman. The revelation that we weren't Dex's only current victims hit Marlo hard. The FBI agent showed us files from 2 other families in Louisiana and Arkansas who'd reported similar thefts in the past month. The amounts were smaller, $20,000 here, $30,000 there, but the pattern was identical. A sick relative needing surgery, desperate need for quick cash, promises of repayment that never came. In Arkansas, the woman's father had suffered a stroke when he learned his retirement savings were gone. In Louisiana, a teenager's college fund had vanished overnight. Dex had been working multiple cons simultaneously. The motel came into view around noon, a run-down place that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions. Dex's room was on the 2nd floor, end unit, probably chosen for its multiple escape routes. But he wouldn't be escaping today. My cousin had coordinated with local police to block all exits, and the FBI agents had a warrant based on the interstate fraud charges. Everything was legal, proper, by the book in a way that Dex's entire life hadn't been. The grandfather clock at home would be chiming 12 right now, marking another moment in our family's strange journey toward justice. We waited in the truck stop parking lot while the authorities moved in, watching through binoculars my cousin had lent us. The arrest should have been simple, but Dex must have sensed something because he tried to run, bolting from the room in nothing but boxers and a t-shirt, clutching a bag that turned out to be full of cash. He made it about 30 feet before the officers tackled him, the bag splitting open and $100 bills scattering in the wind like autumn leaves. Some caught in the motel's chain-link fence, others floating into the parking lot, where curious guests started grabbing them until police secured the scene. The public nature of the arrest drew a crowd, motel guests and passing motorists stopping to watch and record with their phones. Within minutes, the footage was probably already uploading to social media, Dex's face clearly visible as officers hauled him up from the pavement. His left eye was already swelling from the tackle, and his lip was split, blood running down his chin onto the shirt that Marlo had bought him. The designer watch on his wrist, another purchase with our money, caught the sun as they cuffed him. He was screaming about police brutality, about his rights, about everything except his innocence. Marlo watched from her car, and even from 50 feet away, I could see her body shaking with sobs. Whether she was crying for Dex, for herself, or for the baby growing inside her, I couldn't tell. Maybe it was all three. Grief for the life she'd imagined, the family she'd wanted to build with a man who saw her as nothing but a wallet with legs. Jackson walked over to her car, and through the window I saw him put his hand on her shoulder, the child comforting the parent in a reversal that had become too common in their relationship. The FBI agent approached our car after Dex was secured in a police vehicle. He explained that the marked bills had been found not just in the bag, but in Dex's wallet, his car, even sewn into the lining of his jacket. The man had been literally wearing our money. More importantly, they'd found multiple fake IDs, credit cards in different names, and a notebook with details about potential victims, including social security numbers and bank routing information. He wasn't just a thief and a killer. He was a one-man crime syndicate. The drive back to Houston felt different, lighter somehow, despite everything we'd lost and learned. Cordelia dozed in the back seat, exhausted, but with a small smile on her face. Justice for the Houston victim, even if delayed, had given her something chemotherapy couldn't provide. The money would be held as evidence for now, but eventually most of it would be returned. Not all of it. Some had been spent beyond recovery, but enough maybe to get Cordelia into the clinical trial if the spot was still available. Back at home, the grandfather clock chimed 3 in the afternoon as we helped Cordelia to bed. The house felt different now, like a crime scene that had been cleaned but still held traces of what had happened. Marlo's photos with Dex still sat on the mantel, their smiling faces mocking us with lies. The gifts he'd given her were scattered throughout the living room, each one a reminder of how blind she'd been. Jackson began gathering them into a box, methodical and unsentimental, preparing to either sell them or donate them to charity. That evening, as the sun set over Houston, we sat around the kitchen table for the first time in months, as a complete family. Even Marlo was there, quiet and subdued, but present. My cousin had called to confirm that Dex was being held without bail, facing charges that included felony murder, interstate fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. The FBI had connected him to at least 12 other cases across 5 states. He wouldn't be getting out for decades, if ever. The baby Marlo carried would grow up without ever knowing its father, which was probably for the best. "I recorded something else," Jackson said suddenly, pulling out his phone. We all tensed, wondering what other horror he'd documented. But this recording was different. It was from 3 weeks ago, before everything had exploded. Cordelia's voice reading from her old cookbook, talking about Sunday dinners and family traditions. She was laughing in the recording, remembering when Marlo was young and had tried to make breakfast in bed for Mother's Day. It was our family before Dex, preserved in digital amber, proof that we'd been happy once and could be again. The recording played for 5 minutes, and by the end even Marlo was crying again. But different tears this time. Tears of recognition, of remembering who she'd been before the toxic relationships. Cordelia reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. Forgiveness without words, because words would have been inadequate. The cancer might take her body, but it couldn't touch her capacity to love her daughter despite everything. The FBI agent called around 8 that evening with more news. They'd found the Houston victim's stolen jewelry in a storage unit Dex had rented under one of his fake names. Most of it was costume jewelry, but there was one real piece, a wedding ring inscribed with initials and a date from 1962. The FBI would return it to the victim's daughter in Houston, along with the news that his killer had finally been caught. It wasn't much comfort after 3 years, but it was something. Closure, maybe, or at least an ending to one chapter of grief. The marked bills had done more than just track Dex's spending. They'd created a paper trail that connected him to 3 other murders, elderly victims in small towns who'd died during robberies. The UV ink Jackson had used contained specific compounds that could be traced to the exact bottle he'd purchased, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. The 16-year-old boy, who'd been forced to grow up too fast, had built a case that prosecutors were calling airtight. Dex's own arrogance in spending the marked money so freely had been his downfall. Marlo excused herself after the call, and we heard her in the bathroom, sick again from pregnancy or stress or both. The child she carried would be born into a family still healing from trauma, but at least it would be born free from Dex's influence. Jackson had already said he'd help raise his sibling, be the stable presence the baby would need. At 16, he was already more mature than his mother had been at 42. As the night deepened and the house grew quiet, I sat with Cordelia in our bedroom, listening to her labored breathing and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. The doctor had called earlier to say the clinical trial spot was still available if we could make the deposit by Friday. With the money recovered, even if not all of it, we could make it work. We'd sell some things if needed, but Cordelia would get her chance at more time. "Do you think she'll change?" Cordelia asked in the darkness, meaning Marlo. It was the question we'd been asking for years through 3 marriages and countless boyfriends. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the pregnancy, or seeing Dex arrested, or hearing that recording of happier times. Maybe it was Jackson's quiet strength showing her what real love looked like. Or maybe it was just that she'd finally hit bottom. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I know Jackson won't let her fall as far again, and neither will we." Outside, Houston hummed with its usual nighttime symphony. Somewhere in a federal holding cell, Dex was probably still plotting his next move, not understanding that the game was over. Somewhere else, the Houston victim's daughter was getting a call about recovered jewelry and justice finally served. And here in our small house, a family was trying to piece itself back together. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one of the longest days of our lives. But we'd survived it, all of us, even Cordelia, who'd found strength in justice that medicine couldn't provide. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and paperwork and difficult decisions about Marlo's role in everything. But tonight, we were together, broken but not destroyed. The money could be replaced eventually, trust could be slowly rebuilt, but time lost could never be recovered. That was the real crime Dex had committed, stealing time from a dying woman and a family that had precious little of it left. The federal courthouse in downtown Houston rose like a monument to justice, all glass and steel reaching toward the Texas sky. 3 weeks had passed since Dex's arrest. 3 weeks of lawyers and depositions and evidence gathering that had revealed even more victims across 7 states. Marlo had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, a deal that required her to reveal everything she knew about Dex's operations. The morning sickness had gotten worse, forcing her to excuse herself multiple times during questioning, but she'd stayed strong, determined to finally do right by the family she'd nearly destroyed. The FBI agent had called the night before with news that made my blood run cold. They'd found recordings on Dex's phone, hours of audio he'd secretly captured over the past 6 months. Not just conversations with Marlo, but with 14 other women he'd been manipulating simultaneously. Each recording was labeled with a code name and dollar amount. Marlo was listed as Goldfish, worth $250,000. The woman in Arkansas was Butterfly, only worth $30,000. The widow in Louisiana was Diamond, potentially worth $500,000 once her husband's life insurance paid out. We were all just products to him. But there was one recording that changed everything, dated just 2 days before his arrest. In it, Dex was talking to someone he called his partner, apparently part of a larger con game. They discussed their next targets, including 3 elderly couples in Houston. Our neighbor was mentioned by her address, noted for her recent insurance payout. The doctor's family preparing for retirement. The military family who'd received death benefits. These weren't random victims, but carefully researched targets, chosen for their vulnerability and accessible wealth. The recording continued with Dex describing his technique, how he identified women with elderly parents, preferably sick ones who created financial pressure. He looked for signs of previous failed relationships, emotional neediness, desperation for love that made them blind to red flags. He talked about Marlo like she was a textbook case. 3 divorces meant trust issues that made her cling harder once hooked. A sick mother meant guilt that could be exploited. A teenage son meant she craved a complete family unit. Every aspect of her life had been analyzed and weaponized against her. His partner's voice on the recording was equally chilling, discussing their expansion plans like businessmen. They had a whole network of men running similar cons, sharing information about potential victims, even trading women between them when one got too suspicious. The FBI later told us they'd identified 37 men in this network across 12 states, making it one of the largest romance fraud rings ever discovered. Dex hadn't just been a lone predator, but part of an organized crime syndicate. Jackson had been allowed to attend the hearing as a witness, sitting between me and Cordelia in the gallery. His evidence had become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, the marked bills and recordings forming an unbreakable chain that connected Dex not just to our theft, but to the Houston murder. The prosecutor had praised Jackson's methodical documentation, saying most FBI agents couldn't have built a better case. The 16-year-old boy who'd lost his childhood to his mother's bad choices had somehow become the hero of this story. When they played Jackson's recording of Dex confessing to the Houston murder, the courtroom went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing, frozen by the casual cruelty in Dex's voice. The victim's daughter sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she finally heard the truth about her father's last moments. She'd brought the wedding ring the FBI had recovered, wearing it on a chain around her neck, her own way of bringing her father to see justice served. Cordelia had insisted on testifying despite her weakness, wheeled into the courtroom but with her head held high. She spoke about the money meant for her cancer treatment, how every dollar stolen was time taken from her life. The judge, an older man who'd probably seen everything, actually looked moved by her testimony. When she finished by saying she forgave Marlo, but would never forgive Dex, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. The prosecutor then played a new recording, one even we hadn't heard. It was from the night before the theft, Dex coaching Marlo on exactly what to say to the bank manager, how to cry on cue, how to mention her mother's cancer for maximum sympathy. Marlo's voice on the recording was uncertain, questioning whether this was really necessary, and Dex's response was to threaten to leave her. The manipulation was textbook emotional abuse, but it also showed Marlo's participation, her choice to go along with it, despite knowing it was wrong. During a recess, the Houston victim's daughter approached us in the hallway. She wasn't what I'd expected. Younger than Marlo, with kind eyes despite everything. She thanked Jackson for the recordings, for giving her closure after 3 years. Then she did something that surprised us all. She hugged Marlo, who broke down completely, sobbing apologies. 2 women whose lives had been destroyed by the same man, finding a strange sort of sisterhood in their shared tragedy. The afternoon session focused on the financial evidence, the intricate web of bank accounts and fake identities Dex had created. The marked bills had been found in 6 different states, spent at casinos, strip clubs, and luxury stores. Each transaction had been captured on security cameras, creating a visual timeline of Dex's movement after the theft. The FBI's financial crimes expert testified that this was one of the most sophisticated romance fraud operations they'd encountered. Marlo took the stand late in the day, 7 months pregnant now and showing clearly. Her testimony was painful to watch, admitting to things no daughter should have to tell her parents. She'd known Dex was lying about his mother's illness, but convinced herself the money was for their future together. She'd suspected he was still married, but chose not to investigate. She'd heard him mention Houston once in his sleep, but told herself it was just a nightmare. Each admission was another nail in the coffin of the person she'd thought she was. The most damaging part of her testimony came when the prosecutor asked about the pregnancy. Marlo admitted that Dex had been pushing her to get an abortion, saying a baby would interfere with their plans. He'd even given her money for the procedure, money that turned out to be from the marked bills Jackson had planted. She'd kept the cash but decided to keep the baby too. The first time in their relationship, she'd defied him. As the sun set outside the courthouse windows, the prosecutor played one final recording. It was Dex on the phone with his partner again, laughing about how he'd convinced Marlo to put sleeping pills in her parents' coffee if they resisted. The plan had been to drug us, take everything, and disappear. The only reason it hadn't happened was that Marlo had broken down and taken the money while we were at Cordelia's treatment instead. The revelation that Dex had planned to drug us, possibly fatally given Cordelia's condition, sent shockwaves through the courtroom. This wasn't just theft anymore, but conspiracy to commit assault, possibly attempted murder. The judge's face darkened as he listened. What had started as a fraud case had revealed something much darker, a man willing to kill for money who'd done it before and would do it again. That evening, we gathered at a small restaurant near the courthouse, too emotionally drained to cook. The grandfather clock at home would be chiming 7, marking another day survived. Cordelia managed to eat half a bowl of soup, more than she'd managed in days. Jackson sat quietly, processing everything he'd heard, the full scope of how close we'd come to losing everything, including possibly our lives. The Houston victim's daughter joined us, bringing photos of her father from before his death. He'd been a veteran, married for 48 years before his wife died of cancer. She talked about how her father had continued wearing his wedding ring even after her mother's death. Finding it in Dex's storage unit had been like getting a piece of her father back. The conversation turned to the future. What would happen after the trial? Dex faced life in prison for felony murder, plus decades more for the fraud charges. His partner and the network were being rounded up across the country, a massive federal operation that had started with Jackson's marked bills. Marlo would have to testify in multiple trials, reliving her shame over and over. The baby would be born into a family still healing, but committed to breaking the cycle. Cordelia talked about the clinical trial, which had accepted her despite the delay. The treatment was showing promise, possibly adding years to her life instead of months. She wanted to see Marlo's baby born, wanted to help raise it right. She spoke about forgiveness, not for Dex, but for ourselves, for the signs we'd missed, the ways we'd enabled Marlo's pattern of destructive relationships. As we prepared to leave, Jackson pulled out his phone one more time. He'd been recording our dinner conversation, not for evidence, but to capture Cordelia's voice talking about the future, about hope, about family recipes she wanted to pass down. He wanted proof that even after everything, we were still a family. The recording would be a gift to his future sibling, proof that they were wanted despite their origin. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Dex wasn't just a criminal, but a monster who'd planned to drug us, possibly kill us. The network he was part of had destroyed hundreds of families, but they'd been stopped, partly because a 16-year-old boy had been smart enough to mark some bills with UV ink. Back home, the grandfather clock greeted us with its familiar chiming, marking time that suddenly felt more precious than ever. We'd nearly lost everything, not just money, but possibly our lives. But we'd survived, and tomorrow the trial would continue. Justice for the Houston victim, for all the victims, was finally within reach. The recordings would ensure Dex never walked free again, never destroyed another family. The verdict came down on a Tuesday morning that felt more like Judgment Day than just another court date. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation, heavy like the Houston humidity that clung to everything outside. 25 years to life for felony murder, 30 years for interstate fraud, 15 years for conspiracy, all to be served consecutively. The judge's gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the wood-paneled room, reverberating off walls that had witnessed countless stories of crime and punishment, but few as twisted as this one. Dex would die in prison, never seeing freedom again, never feeling sunshine as a free man, never destroying another family with his poisonous charm. When the judge read the sentence, his voice carried the weight of all the victims who'd suffered, all the elderly people who'd died clutching their chests in fear, all the families torn apart by greed dressed up as love. The courtroom erupted in quiet satisfaction, not celebration, but relief, the kind that comes when a long nightmare finally ends, and you wake to find the monster was real, but has been caged forever. Marlo had gone into labor during the sentencing, the stress of hearing her former lover condemned to die behind bars triggering contractions 8 weeks early. Her water broke right there in the gallery, spreading across the polished floor like spilled truth that couldn't be taken back. The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics navigating through the crowd of reporters who smelled blood in the water, their cameras clicking like hungry insects. The stretcher wheels squeaked against the marble courthouse floors, a mundane sound that somehow felt prophetic. Cordelia insisted on riding with her daughter despite her own weakness, her thin frame barely filling the paramedic's jacket they'd draped over her shoulders. She held Marlo's hand with fingers that felt like bird bones, fragile but still capable of comfort. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that new life was arriving just as Dex's life effectively ended. One soul entering the world as another was condemned to leave it in a concrete box, one beginning as another concluded behind bars that would never open again. The baby came fast at the hospital, too fast for epidurals or much preparation, arriving with the same unexpected intensity that had marked her conception. The delivery room smelled of antiseptic and fear, the bright lights overhead harsh after the dim courthouse. Marlo screamed not just from physical pain, but from the emotional weight of delivering a killer's child while that killer was being processed into federal prison. A girl emerged, tiny but fierce, her first cry piercing the sterile air like a declaration of independence from her father's evil legacy. Her skin was pink and wrinkled, her fists clenched as if ready to fight the world that had already tried to destroy her before birth. The nurses weighed her at 4 pounds 12 ounces, small, but within the range of survival, a fighter's weight. Marlo named her Hope, which might have seemed cliché to anyone who hadn't lived through our nightmare, except it was exactly what our family needed. Hope that cycles could be broken like chains rusted through with tears and determination, that children didn't have to repeat their parents' mistakes like some genetic curse, that DNA wasn't destiny. The nurses said she was healthy, despite being premature, her lungs strong enough to breathe on their own, a fighter like her brother Jackson, who'd fought a different kind of battle with marked bills instead of fists. The news coverage of the trial had attracted attention from victims across the country, their stories emerging from shadows like moths drawn to the light of justice finally served. They started a support group that met online every Thursday evening, voices connecting across distances through computer screens, sharing their stories of manipulation and slowly rebuilding their ability to trust. The group's website crashed 3 times from the volume of people trying to join, each one carrying their own tale of love weaponized against them. Marlo joined after getting out of the hospital, her laptop balanced on her knees while Hope slept in a bassinet beside her, listening to others who'd been manipulated by men who saw vulnerability as opportunity. The group leader, a woman from Seattle who'd lost her house and retirement to a similar con, became Marlo's sponsor in what they called recovery from toxic love addiction. Their late-night phone calls became lifelines. 2 women who'd given everything to men who deserved nothing, learning to forgive themselves one conversation at a time. 3 months after Hope's birth, on a morning when the spring rain drummed against our windows like nervous fingers, we received an unexpected visit from the FBI. The agent stood in our doorway, holding a briefcase that seemed to contain the weight of hundreds of victims' stories. They'd been investigating the network's finances for months, following money trails through digital labyrinths that spanned continents, and discovered something shocking hidden in layers of shell companies and cryptocurrency wallets. The syndicate had been laundering money through Bitcoin and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, amassing nearly $20 million over 5 years of destroying families. The number seemed impossible, obscene, each dollar representing someone's retirement, someone's medical treatment, someone's last hope. Under federal asset forfeiture laws that had been strengthened after our case made headlines, that money would be distributed to victims based on documented losses. Our family's share, calculated based on our losses and Jackson's crucial role in breaking the case, would be $400,000. More than we'd lost, more than we'd dreamed of recovering. Enough for Cordelia's treatment and Hope's future education at any college she might choose. The check would take 6 weeks to process, the agent explained, but it was guaranteed, as certain as Dex's imprisonment. The clinical trial at MD Anderson had been working better than anyone expected. The experimental drugs attacking Cordelia's tumors like an army that had finally found the right battle strategy. Her oncologist, a soft-spoken woman who'd seen too much death to offer false hope, actually smiled when showing us the latest scans. The tumors had shrunk by 60% in 4 months, shadows retreating from her lungs like storm clouds dissipating after hurricane season. The doctors called it remarkable, used words like unprecedented response and exceptional outcome, though Cordelia insisted the real medicine had been seeing justice served, watching Dex sentenced, knowing he could never hurt another family. She spent her good days in the kitchen teaching Marlo to cook the family recipes that had been passed down through 3 generations, their hands working together to knead bread dough that connected past to future. The kitchen became their healing space, mother and daughter working side by side over simmering pots of soup that filled the house with the smell of comfort, Hope sleeping in a bouncer on the counter while the afternoon sun slanted through windows we'd finally been able to repair. The grandfather clock ticked peacefully in the hallway, no longer counting down to disaster, but marking moments of quiet redemption. Jackson had started his senior year of high school with a different perspective than his classmates, his eyes carrying knowledge that textbooks couldn't teach. While they worried about prom dates and college applications, stressed about SAT scores and scholarship essays, he'd already faced real evil and won using nothing but UV ink and patience. His criminal justice teacher, a former prosecutor who recognized trauma when she saw it, asked him to speak to the class about the case that had made national news, but he declined with characteristic humility, saying heroes don't seek spotlight. They just do what needs doing. Instead, he wrote an essay about systematic vulnerability in elderly populations that explored how predators identified and exploited their victims, how loneliness became a weapon in the wrong hands. The essay won a national competition judged by FBI professionals and earned him a full scholarship to Rice University worth $200,000 over 4 years. The Houston Police Department, embarrassed by how long Dex had operated in their jurisdiction, started using our case as a training example for new detectives. A detective who'd become a family friend through the trial asked Jackson to help develop a presentation for senior centers throughout Harris County, teaching elderly people to recognize manipulation tactics before they became victims. Jackson created a simple checklist based on Dex's methods, warning signs printed on laminated cards that could fit in a wallet. The program launched citywide with funding from the asset forfeiture money, potentially saving dozens of families from similar trauma. Elderly people would sit in community center rooms that smelled of coffee and old paper, learning to protect themselves from wolves dressed as lovers. Dex's partner had been arrested in Florida trying to flee to Cuba on a boat loaded with cash and fake passports. His trial in Miami revealed even more about the network's operations, including a detailed database of 10,000 potential victims across the country, their financial information harvested from data breaches and social media. Each entry included net worth estimates, family situations, and vulnerability scores calculated with algorithmic precision. The FBI used this information to warn people they were being targeted, calling them one by one with news that must have felt like dodging a bullet they didn't know had been fired. Several women called to thank Jackson personally through the FBI, saying his marked bills technique had saved their parents' life savings from disappearing into the same black hole that had nearly swallowed our family. He always deflected credit with the same quiet grace, but we knew better than to believe his modesty. One evening in October, as autumn settled over Houston and painted the trees in shades of fire, we received a package with no return address wrapped in brown paper that felt soft with age. Inside was the Houston victim's journal from the months before his death, pages yellowed and slightly water-damaged, sent by his daughter who'd found it while cleaning out her father's apartment. He'd written about his wife's cancer battle in handwriting that grew shakier as the entries progressed, the costs that insurance wouldn't cover because experimental treatments were deemed unnecessary, his decision to keep the store open despite his arthritis, because regular customers depended on him for repairs. The final entry, dated the day before his murder, talked about looking forward to seeing his wife again soon in whatever came after, sensing his time was near with the intuition of the old. It was heartbreaking and beautiful, the words of a good man who'd died for $43 that Dex had complained wasn't worth the effort. Marlo read the journal aloud to us after dinner while Hope nursed, tears streaming down her face and dropping onto the pages as she recognized the parallels that connected two families through tragedy. The Houston victim had been trying to save money for his granddaughter's wedding at a church in River Oaks, just as we'd been saving for Cordelia's treatment at the same hospital where his wife had died. His wife had passed from the same type of lung cancer Cordelia was fighting, had even been treated by some of the same doctors who now knew our story too. The only difference was that our story had a different ending because a 16-year-old boy had refused to let evil win, had chosen to fight back with methods learned from a school project about federal law enforcement techniques. The romance fraud network's collapse made national news on every major network, with congressional hearings about elderly protection broadcast on C-SPAN to empty chambers and concerned families. Jackson was invited to testify in Washington, but declined the plane ticket and hotel room, sending a written statement instead that focused on prevention rather than punishment. His words were entered into the congressional record, a teenager's wisdom preserved in the National Archives between speeches from senators who'd never experienced betrayal firsthand. Several states passed laws increasing penalties for romance fraud targeting elderly victims, informally called victim protection laws after the Houston case that had started it all with marked bills and recorded confessions. Cordelia's health stabilized enough for her to attend Hope's baptism 6 months later, a small ceremony at our church where the stained glass windows cast rainbow light across the baptismal font. Marlo stood alone at the altar in a simple dress she'd bought with her own earned money, holding her daughter, who wore the same christening gown Marlo had worn 30 years earlier, flanked by her son and parents, but no romantic partner. No toxic man beside her making promises he'd break, just family and the honest hope for redemption that didn't depend on anyone else's love. The priest, who'd known our family through 3 generations of joy and sorrow, spoke about resurrection not just of body, but of spirit, of families rising from ashes of betrayal stronger than before they burned. The holy water touched Hope's forehead, and she didn't cry, just looked up with eyes that would never know her biological father's evil. That Christmas was the first in years where we were all truly present, not just physically, but emotionally engaged with each other instead of lost in private disasters. The tree stood in its usual corner between the grandfather clock and the window, decorated with ornaments dating back to Marlo's childhood, including the paper angels she'd made in kindergarten. Hope, now 8 months old with chubby fingers that grabbed at everything within reach, pulled at the lights, while Jackson watched carefully from his position on the floor beside her, ready to intervene if she found something dangerous. Marlo had been sober from toxic relationships for a full year, attending therapy twice weekly with a counselor who specialized in manipulation recovery, slowly rebuilding her identity outside of male validation that had nearly killed us all. The turkey was slightly overcooked, but nobody complained, grateful to be together, to be alive, to be free from Dex's shadow. The grandfather clock that had marked so many dark moments, that had counted down to disaster and measured the hours of our despair, now counted happy ones with the same steady rhythm. Hope's first word came at 9 months. Surprisingly, it was Jax instead of Mama or Dada, as if she knew who'd really saved her from a life of lies. Cordelia's clear scan showing continued tumor shrinkage arrived on a Tuesday that felt like Christmas morning. Marlo's 1-year anniversary at her new job at a pediatric clinic, where she helped children instead of dangerous men. Jackson's acceptance letter to Rice University arrived in an envelope that seemed too thin to carry such heavy dreams. Each chime of the grandfather clock marked time we'd almost lost, moments that Dex had tried to steal, but failed to destroy. The clock had outlasted another family crisis, would outlast us all, carrying forward the story of a family that refused to break, even when bent to the point of snapping. The Houston victim's daughter visited for Hope's first birthday, bringing a gift that made us all cry. It was a silver rattle engraved with Hope on one side and her father's initials on the other, made from silver recovered from his store. She said her father would have wanted beauty from tragedy. Watching her hold Hope, seeing her smile, was its own kind of justice. The money from asset forfeiture had been carefully invested, most for Cordelia's treatment, but some for Hope's future. Marlo insisted on putting Jackson's name on the account, recognizing he'd saved them all. At 18, he was more responsible than she'd been at 42. She'd started community college, studying to become a counselor specializing in manipulation recovery. A documentary filmmaker contacted us, but we declined as a family. Jackson did agree to be interviewed for an FBI training video, his face blurred but words clear. The video became required viewing at Quantico, a teenager teaching federal agents about patience and observation. 2 years after the arrest, Dex tried to appeal, claiming ineffective counsel. The appeal was denied in less than an hour, the judges noting the overwhelming evidence. Dex had also been attacked in prison by another inmate whose grandmother had been victimized. He survived, but was permanently scarred. We didn't celebrate his suffering, but neither did we mourn it. Marlo met someone new at her support group, a man whose ex-wife had emptied their accounts for gambling. They took things slowly, friends for a year before dating. He was good with Hope, patient with Marlo's trust issues, and respectful of our family's wariness. He understood he had to earn acceptance. The grandfather clock needed repair after decades of service. The clockmaker mentioned it was one of the oldest still working. Like our family, it had taken damage but kept functioning. When he finished repairs, it chimed clearer than ever, ready for another generation. Cordelia lived to see Hope's 3rd birthday, defying predictions. The clinical trial had given her 5 years instead of 6 months. She died on a spring morning, surrounded by family, the grandfather clock chiming noon as she took her final breath. Her last words were about forgiveness, about love transcending mistakes, about being proud of how we'd all grown. The funeral was attended by hundreds, including the Houston victim's daughter, the FBI agent, the detective, and dozens Marlo had helped. The priest spoke about how Cordelia's legacy lived on through lives saved by our case. Jackson, now 21 and in law school, gave the eulogy about how his grandmother's illness had led to their greatest trial, but also triumph. 6 months after Cordelia's death, we received word that Dex had died in prison. Heart attack, the same way the Houston victim had died. There was poetic justice in it, the killer dying the same way as his victim, alone and afraid. We didn't attend the burial. His death closed the final chapter, allowing us to fully move forward. Hope grew up knowing her story, the truth told in age-appropriate pieces. By 5, she understood bad people existed, but good people had stopped them. By 10, she knew the full story, and chose to see herself as proof that good could come from evil. She had Jackson's intelligence and Marlo's emotional intensity, channeled positively. The cycle had been broken. 10 years have passed since that morning I found our safe empty, and I'm sitting in the same kitchen where everything fell apart, watching Hope do her homework at the table where Jackson once spread out evidence that would destroy a nationwide crime ring. She has her brother's intensity when concentrating, chewing her lip the same way he did when planning Dex's downfall. Sometimes I look at her and feel a ghost of fear, wondering if evil can be inherited. But then she laughs at something on her tablet, and she's just a 10-year-old girl who happens to exist because a monster once walked through our door. Jackson practices law now, specializing in elder abuse cases, turning our family's nightmare into a career of protecting others. He married the Houston victim's granddaughter last spring, a connection that would seem impossible if you didn't understand how trauma can forge the strongest bonds. They met at a survivors' conference 5 years ago, 2 children of tragedy who understood each other's shadows. Their wedding was small, family only, with Hope as flower girl throwing petals under the watch of that same grandfather clock. Marlo runs a non-profit now called After the Con, helping romance fraud victims rebuild their lives and dignity. She never married her friend from the support group, realizing she needed to be alone to truly heal. But they remain close and co-parent Hope in every way that matters. She speaks at senior centers, her story a warning wrapped in redemption. The shame never fully leaves her eyes, but she's transformed it into purpose, saving other families from our fate. The money from the FBI allowed me to keep the house after Cordelia died, this museum of memories both beautiful and terrible. Her pictures still cover the mantel, and sometimes I catch Hope studying them, trying to understand the grandmother she barely knew, but who fought death long enough to see her born. The clinical trial that saved Cordelia's life for those extra years has since saved hundreds of others, partly funded by donations from romance fraud survivors who heard our story. "Grandpa," Hope says suddenly, looking up from her homework, "was my biological father really that evil? Or do people exaggerate because of what happened?" It's not the first time she's asked, won't be the last, each version of the question growing more sophisticated as she ages. I tell her the truth, that Dex was broken in ways that broke others, that evil isn't born, but chosen through 1,000 small decisions to value yourself over everyone else. She nods, processing this like she processes everything, with a maturity that comes from growing up in truth rather than comfortable lies. The letter arrives that afternoon, forwarded from the FBI, originally sent to their Dallas office. It's from one of Dex's other children, a son who just turned 18 and tracked us down through court records. He wants to meet Hope, to know his half-sister, to understand his father through the eyes of those who stopped him. Jackson advises against it legally. Marlowe panics emotionally. But Hope surprises us all by saying yes. She wants to meet him, wants to see if evil really runs in blood, or if people choose their own paths. The meeting happens at a public park, Jackson and Marlowe's friend flanking Hope like bodyguards while the young man approaches alone, looking nothing like Dex except for the eyes that carry the same intensity. He brings photos of 12 other half-siblings scattered across 7 states, Dex's legacy of abandoned children raised by single mothers he'd conned and left. He's organizing them into their own support group, children of a predator trying to prove they're nothing like their father. Hope listens to his story, then tells her own 2 teenagers connected by DNA and disaster, choosing to see each other as survivors rather than threats. That night, Hope asks to see the recordings Jackson made all those years ago. We've kept them locked away, evidence of the worst time in our lives, but she insists she needs to hear Dex's voice to understand where she came from. We play her one recording, just audio of him laughing about the Houston murder, and she listens with tears streaming down her face before saying quietly, "I'm nothing like him. I'm like you, all of you, who stopped him." The relief in her voice breaks my heart and heals it simultaneously. The grandfather clock chimes midnight as we sit together. 4 generations, if you count Cordelia's presence in everything we do. Marlowe makes tea using her mother's recipe. Jackson reviews case files for tomorrow's trial, defending an elderly couple from their predatory grandson. Hope finishes her essay about family for English class. She's writing about us, about how family isn't blood, but choice, how the people who raise you matter more than those who create you. Her teacher will probably think it's fiction, too dramatic to be real, not knowing every word is true. Sometimes the phone rings, and it's another victim, someone who found Marlowe's nonprofit or read about our case, desperate for proof that you can survive betrayal by those you love. Marlowe takes every call, walks them through the process, connects them with resources, becomes the advocate she wished she'd had. The wall of her office is covered with thank you cards, hundreds of families saved from financial ruin and emotional destruction. It doesn't erase what she did to us, but it balances the scales somehow, turning destruction into construction. Marlowe's friend proposed again last week, the 3rd time in 10 years, and this time Marlowe said maybe, which is progress from her previous automatic no. She's learned to trust again in careful measures, like someone relearning to walk after paralysis. He's patient, understanding that some wounds never fully heal, that he'll always be compared to a monster who taught her that love could kill. Hope calls him Dad because he's been there since before she could remember. The only father she's known, proof that family is built through presence rather than blood. I drive past the Bluebonnet Inn sometimes, that motel where everything unraveled, now demolished and replaced with a shopping center. The spot where Dex was arrested is under a Starbucks, Teenage baristas serving lattes where FBI agents once tackled a killer. Progress covers crime scenes. Time softens sharp edges, but memory persists. I can still see Marlowe's face when she realized Dex had abandoned her. Jackson's calm certainty as he revealed his plan. Cordelia's fierce determination to see justice despite dying. The greatest revenge, I've learned, isn't punishment, but prevention. Not destroying those who hurt you, but stopping them from hurting others. Jackson's marked bills didn't just catch Dex. They created a template now used by law enforcement nationwide. Hope's existence proves that good can come from evil origins. Marlowe's nonprofit has saved more families than Dex destroyed. We didn't just survive, we transformed trauma into purpose, turned our family's near destruction into other families' salvation. Sometimes the youngest family member sees the clearest. Has a teenager in your family ever solved an adult problem? Share your story below. And remember, if you're experiencing romance fraud or elder abuse, you're not alone, and it's not too late to get help. The grandfather clock strikes 1 in the morning, and I realize I've been sitting here for hours, writing this story for Hope to read when she's older, when she needs to know the full truth about how she came to exist. Outside, Houston sleeps peacefully, unaware that in this small house sits a family that stopped a monster with marked bills and recorded confessions. We're not heroes, just people who refused to let evil win, who chose justice over comfortable silence, who learned that family isn't about perfection, but about showing up when everything falls apart. The clock keeps ticking, counting moments of peace earned through pain, marking time that Cordelia bought with her courage, that Jackson protected with his intelligence, that Marlowe reclaimed through confession, that Hope inherited through no fault of her own. Thank you for listening to our story. What would you have done if your own child stole your life savings for someone they loved? Would you seek justice or let them learn from their mistakes? Please leave a comment below with your thoughts, and if this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear.